Hello, everyone, and welcome. We honor Veterans Day with this special presentation, The Life of a Navajo Code Talker, Carl Gorman and the First 29, with our guest, Zonnie Gorman. My name is Sandra Goldfield, and I am the chair of the Native and Indigenous Allies Committee of Chicago Public Library. I am here today with Adam Foreman, Associate Director of Education with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. CPL is delighted to co-host this event with the Pritzker Museum and thanks Adam and the museum for hosting on their site. Chicago is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, also called this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides here in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life of this city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. Chicago Public Library and the Pritzker Military Museum and Library invite all to learn from and celebrate our Native and Indigenous neighbors in Chicago, the Midwest, and everywhere. And now I'd like to introduce Zonnie Gorman. Zonnie Gorman is a recognized historian on the Navajo Code Talkers of World War II. She is the daughter of the late Dr. Carl N. Gorman, one of the original Code Talkers, and sister to renowned Navajo artist R.C. Gorman. Zonnie has lectured extensively throughout the United States at universities, colleges, museums, and other institutions, including the Museum of the American Indian and at the NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Zonnie has appeared in several documentaries, including the History Channel's In Search of History, Navajo Code Talkers, the MGM DVD release of Wind Talkers, and the PBS documentary Through Whispers. Zonnie earned her MA in history from the University of New Mexico, and her thesis, The Navajo Code Talkers of World War II, the First 29, included interviews with several of the original Navajo Code Talkers. She's now working on her PhD. Zonnie is a current member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Western History Association, the Society for Military History, and the Navajo Studies Conference. Zonnie, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I totally appreciate it. And Sandra and Adam, thank you for all the work that you did to make this happen. I'd like to thank the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and the Chicago Public Library for making this presentation available to everyone. As I was just introduced, I am the daughter of a Navajo Code Talker, Carl Gorman, and you can see his photograph here. This photograph was actually taken on Saipan at an observation point in 1944, overlooking the city of Garapan in Saipan. My father was a member of the original group of Navajo Code Talkers, and what I mean by the original group is that they were the pilot group that was recruited in 1942 to basically prove that it was going to be viable to utilize Navajo as a code. So I grew up with this story. I don't know how many of you out there may have perhaps be only children or like myself, a late baby. So it was kind of like you were an only child. But if you have that experience, you know what I mean when I say that you get dragged to everything that your parents go to. And fortunately, I got dragged to some really amazing events. I got dragged to a lot of Navajo Code Talker meetings in the early 1970s when they first formed their Navajo Code Talker Association. I got volunteered to carry the banner in a lot of the parades that they participated in over the years. So, you know, and I also love history. So the story just seeped into my bones, and it's been a lifelong journey for me, researching particularly this original group of Code Talkers, the pilot group. So I'm going to be sharing with you the story of both my father as well as this group, and share a little bit about the great, wonderful code that they created that really set the program in motion. Okay. So before we really get started here, I'd like to kind of situate where the Navajo Nation is located, and of course, where these men came from and come from. You can see the little red square there, of course. That is blown up there is a picture of the Navajo Nation. The gray section there that covers parts of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah is the Navajo Nation. There are 3 small satellite sections you can see in New Mexico. And then the little kind of white area there in between the gray spot, that's the Hopi Nation. And then the little blue star there, that is just about approximately where my father was born and raised, in a community called Chinle, Arizona. Some of you may be familiar with Canyon de Chelly National Monument, perhaps even visited. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful space if you ever get a chance to come and visit. My father grew up in Chinle, which is right at the mouth of Canyon de Chelly, but he had lots of stories of riding his favorite horse into the canyon as a young boy. The canyon is well known for a lot of Anasazi ruins. You can see ruins there at the base of the cliff, and then natural spaces. This is what we call Spider Rock, and this is where, in our traditional stories, Spider Woman lives on top of this rock. Okay, so now that you have a sense of where my family is from, my family is somewhat atypical of Navajo families of that particular era in the 1900s. This is a photograph of my grandmother, Alice Peshlakai Gorman, and her oldest daughter, Mary, and the little boy on her lap is my father, Carl. My grandmother was, well, both my grandmother and my grandfather were some of the early Navajos that were taken off to boarding schools in the 1880s. My grandmother in particular went to a school in Grand Junction, Colorado, a boarding school, and she fell in love with music while she was there. She was also converted to Presbyterianism. And when she returned to the Navajo Nation, her family donated a large section of land to build a church. And she also translated over 30 hymns into the Navajo language. And you can see here one of the hymns that she translated with her name in the top left corner there. She translated over 30 hymns, and many of these songs are still sung across the reservation today. Now, when she graduated around the turn of the century, she came home and she met a man by the name of Nelson Gorman. And he too had been an early boarding school attendee, and he was taken as a young boy to Santa Fe Indian School in New Mexico. So he was bilingual, which was not really common at that time. This again is around the 1900s. So he was working and had been hired and working as an interpreter for the Fort Defiance Agency for the federal government at the time. And Alice and Nelson met and fell in love and married in 1903. Now, my grandfather was also an entrepreneur, which was also very rare at the time. But he opened actually 3 different trading posts at one time. He was one of the early Navajos to open a trading post on the reservation. Most of the traders at that time were white people that had moved on to into our country. But he opened a trading post, and his most famous one was right at the mouth of Canyon de Chelly. And this is a photograph of that trading post. So Alice and Mary had 5 children in total. They had 3 boys and 2 girls. The oldest, going back to that first picture, was Mary. And then there was another little baby who was the last of the bunch. Her name was Amy. And then there were 3 boys in the middle. These are 2 of the boys and their cousin in this particular photograph. But I want to tell you about the 3 boys first. So my father was the oldest boy, and then there was Wallace, and then there was another young boy named Steve. The 2 girls, when Mary was about 18 years old and Amy was about 6 months, the flu epidemic of 1918 hit. And both of those girls died during that pandemic, and only the 3 boys survived. So on the Navajo Nation at this time, as I said, my grandparents were some of the first Navajos to be taken away to boarding school. And there was a policy in the federal government that Indian children had to go to school. And of course, there were no schools on the reservation, so they would often come out, round up these children, and take them by force to many of the federal Indian boarding schools. Some of the kids were taken or sent by their parents or went willingly, but this was not really the occasion. What often happened was that these children were forced to go to boarding schools. But my father, because his parents had been educated, they felt pretty good about sending their kids to a school. And they sent my father and his brother Wallace to a mission school just outside of Gallup, New Mexico, called Rehoboth. And you can see a picture here of my dad. He's right there in the middle. He was about 10 years old at this time. And his brother Wallace is the smaller of the 2 boys. If you're looking at the photo, it's to your right. And then the other young boy is his cousin, Frank. You can see that they're wearing military-style uniforms. This was very common during this particular time, whether you were in a mission school or whether you were in a federal boarding school, to wear uniforms. And the policies of the schools followed very much kind of a military life. The children would wake up to revelry oftentimes. They would be marched back and forth to school or to the dining room. They would have structured calisthenics that they would do. And they were not permitted to speak their native languages. They were punished. And my father, while he was a student here, was punished quite severely. And again, this was in the early 1900s. My father was kind of a rebel at the time. He liked to do things that he probably shouldn't do, and he would often get in trouble. And one of them was speaking Navajo. And what they would do is they would give them demerits. And my dad racked up a number of demerits that got him in trouble. And he was placed in the basement that was under the church at the school. And he said that they fed him bread and water for 3 days. And so he decided he was going to run away when he got out of there. So he talked his brother, or his cousin, actually, he talked Frank into going with him. They were about the same age. And when they ran away, it was in October, and it was cold. And they lived a good 140 miles away from where they were running away from. And it took them about 3 days to get home. And halfway through, they noticed that someone was following them, and their little brother Wallace had followed them. But this was very common. Children would often run away from these boarding schools, and sometimes they they would send out police officers to round these kids up and take them back to school. So that was my father's early experience in the boarding schools. Eventually, he ended up going to the Albuquerque Indian School, where he graduated in 1928. And this is a photograph of my dad not long after he graduated. And this is actually a page out of his high school yearbook. And he's about there in the middle. I'll expand it for you there. You can see Carl Gorman, Navajo, and you see Firpo in quotation marks. My dad was a boxer. He learned to box in boarding school. In many, many instances, particularly boys were encouraged very strongly to play all kinds of sports, boxing, basketball, football in particular. And my father was very much involved in a lot of that. He was a boxer. Now, Firpo, I've done a little bit of research. There's actually two different boxers, so I'm not quite sure, but they called him Navajo Firpo. So he must have been a pretty good boxer. He was also on the football team. And amazingly, there are some photographs of his football team here, and he's actually in all of those photographs. It's kind of hard to point out which ones are him, but let's see. The one of the boys sitting on the stairs of the gazebo there, this was located on the Albuquerque Indian School campus. You can see on the very top row, the man in the middle with a suit on is their coach. And as you're looking at that photograph, my father is to the right of the coach. Okay, so my father graduated from the Albuquerque Indian School in 1928. These federal boarding schools were geared toward teaching both boys and girls industrial education, not so much an academic education. And they did have some academics, but when they graduated, they weren't necessarily given what we expect today, a high school diploma. They were given a certificate, and my father's certificate was in farming. And he said that he was so disgusted with that, he tore it up and was really upset that he didn't get a high school diploma. After he left high school, he went back home. He eventually got a job working for the federal government as an interpreter. And that's what he was doing just before World War II broke out. My father, of course, was bilingual. And the job that he had as an interpreter was right previous to the war. And when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th, 1941, the federal government immediately laid off a lot of their employees on the Navajo reservation. And most of those employees were the interpreters, stock reduction people. Most of them were Navajos. And so my father was laid off with a number of his friends. And, you know, what is a guy to do when you don't have a job, right? They would just kind of hang out, and playing cards was a big deal back then. You know, when people got together, they would play cards. And so my dad would tell a story about playing cards. And one evening, there was a bunch of guys playing cards in a hogan, and people were coming in and out, joining the game, leaving the game. And there was one man who came in at one point and joined the group, and he started to tell a story that he had been over to the local trading post, and he had heard from the trader that he had received a message over shortwave radio that the Marines were on the Navajo reservation, and they were looking for a few good Navajos to join the Marine Corps. And so the men started talking, and gee, you know, I wonder what's going, you know, they knew the war had broken out, but, you know, they were really curious about why the Marines were looking for a few good Navajos. So they joked about, you know, different things, and maybe they could get a job in Washington, D.C., and they'd get to wear these nice, you know, great uniforms. So anyway, whatever the case may be, they talked themselves into a very patriotic mode, and several of them decided they were going to leave right then and there and go join the Marine Corps. So my father and a couple of friends of his left in the middle of the night. They rode all night long to a place called Fort Defiance, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, where the Marine Corps had set up their mobile recruiting unit at that point and were recruiting Navajos. So the Marine Corps had been approached in February by a gentleman who was the son of a missionary. In 1942, he was in his early 50s, but as a young boy and the son of a missionary, he had grown up on the Navajo Reservation. And he had learned to speak Navajo. He played with Navajo kids once in a while. He was sent off and on the reservation, to attend school. But he spoke enough Navajo that he had a good working knowledge of the language. And during the war, during World War II, he decided that, or he had read an article actually, that the U.S. Army had used Native Americans in communications during World War I. And he thought, gee, they should use Navajo. They should use this language that he was very familiar with. So to make a long story short, he approached initially the Navy, and the Navy sent him down to the Marine Corps down in San Diego, California. Philip Johnson at that time was a civil engineer working in Los Angeles. And so it was pretty easy for him to visit these places. So he goes on down to the Marine base in February of 1942. He presents this idea. He brings some Navajos to base. They do a demonstration. General Clayton B. Vogel was at this demonstration, and he wrote a very intriguing two-page memorandum to the commandant following this demonstration, basically gushing over the fact that this was a very successful demonstration. The messages were sent almost verbatim. And he was just really, really intrigued with the fact that the Navajos were able to translate these messages back and forth very quickly. So at the very end of this memorandum, General Clayton B. Vogel suggested to the commandant, or recommended to the commandant, that 200 Navajos should immediately be recruited for this program. Well, the commandant wasn't too sure about this. I mean, he hadn't seen the demonstration, but he was very innovative. And of course, he was in the middle of a war. So he thought, okay, let's look into this idea. So the Marine Corps looked into it from the middle of February to the first week of April. There's a whole slew of memorandums. If you go to the National Archives, you'll find a whole bunch of memorandums during this period where the Marine Corps was looking into this idea. Were there enough Navajos? Were there enough Navajos who were bilingual who would be able to do this? These kinds of questions. So in the first week of April in 1942, the commandant finally cut orders to recruit 30 Navajos as a pilot group. So 2 recruiting teams were sent to the Navajo Nation, one from San Francisco, California, where the Western Recruiting Division was located, and one team from Phoenix, which was a regional recruiting division. So these 2 teams came up to the reservation in April. One team focused their attention on the boarding schools, and they visited 3 of the largest boarding schools on the Navajo reservation at that time, which included Fort Wingate, just outside of Gallup, New Mexico, on the very edge of the southern part of the reservation. And then Shiprock, which was located in the northern part of the reservation in New Mexico. And then over into Arizona, they went to a place called Tuba City. And there was a large boarding school located there. The other team focused their attention on recruiting men who were older and working for the federal government, like my dad. So this first group of men that were recruited, you can see a photograph here. This is actually one of those very small little tiny brownie photographs that were very popular at the time. You can see some damage on the top of this photograph up on the very top. It's kind of crinkled. My father had this photo expanded, enlarged, and as you can see, at one point, my father and somebody or a couple men, I don't know exactly who, this was way before I was an adult, so I don't know exactly when this happened, but they were trying to identify these men way back when. There are actually a few of these men that are misidentified. But this group was the original group that was recruited as the pilot. Now, there were supposed to be 30 of them, and there were actually only 29 that showed up. So they became known as the first 29. And this photograph was actually taken by a family member of one of these men. The photo was eventually given to my dad at some point. And there are only 25 and a half. You can see one man there, unfortunately, is kind of cut in half in that photograph. But the federal government had an official photographer, and they happened to send this official photographer to Fort Wingate on May 4th, 1942, which is the day that the Marine Corps brought all of these men together to swear them into the Marine Corps and send them off to San Diego for boot camp training. So let me show you some of these photographs. Fortunately, the photographer actually caught a photograph of the first 29 being sworn into the Marine Corps on May 4th, 1942. You can see a couple of Marines. You can see a Navy doctor there. The major who is swearing them into the Marine Corps, his name was Major Frank Shannon, and he was the NCO in charge of recruiting out of Phoenix, Arizona. Fort Wingate at that time it had originally been an Army fort, and then it was converted in the 1920s into a federal boarding school. And as a boarding school, they obviously had a dining hall. And so these men were able to get a meal before they were put on the bus and sent to California. So again, you can see Major Shannon and one of the Navy doctors. You can see several of the men sitting at a table. The man that is looking over his shoulder at you is my dad. And I'd like to point out, as you're looking at the photograph to the right, there's a man, or he looks like a young boy, kind of to the side there. His name is Wilsey Bitsy, and he was one of two young men who were in this group that were actually underage. They were just shy of 16 when they entered into this program. My father, on the other hand, also lied about his age to get in the Marine Corps, but he lowered his age. He thought he was too old. He was 35 at the time of his enlistment, and his discharge paper shows that he lied and said he was 10 years younger. Again, Major Frank Shannon, one of the Navy doctors, the young man that's standing there leaning up against the car in a suit with his hands in his pockets, that's my dad. And then there's several photographs of group shots, right? When you have a group of guys, you always have to have a bunch of group shots. So there were several photographs taken of these men, kind of the whole group. But notice behind them that there's a very large building, two-story building. That was actually the barracks to the Army when Fort Wingate was an Army depot. And when it was converted into a boarding school, this building and another one very similar to it were converted into dormitories. This particular one was the boys' dormitory. You'll notice right behind the men, there's a Greyhound bus. They're going to get on that bus. They're going to travel all night long to San Diego, California. And life's going to be a whole lot different because now they're going to be in the Marine Corps. So when they get to San Diego, California, they're placed into their own platoon. They put all 29 of these men into a platoon, which was Platoon 382. And it was the first all-Indian, all-Navajo platoon in the history of the Marine Corps. Now, this particular article that came out that you see here was about 1 week into their training. And the article is, in terms of today's standards, would be very politically incorrect. Because it talks about how these men were Indians, right? And there was this fascination with having this platoon of all Indians in the Marine Corps. And they were talking about how this group was adapting well to the military, basically because they were Indians. They were well disciplined because they were Indians. Everything was great about them because they were Indians. And in fact, there's one quote in here that kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. As I said, there was stereotypical assumptions about Indian prowess in this article. And this particular quote here is in this article. They call them magnificent specimens of original American manhood. So that gives you an idea of when they first get into boot camp and kind of this fascination with them. Of course, there was nothing in this article about why they were there. That was secret, but the article does give us a good idea of how they were doing the first week in boot camp. Well, 7 weeks of boot camp, and now all of a sudden at the end, they're graduating. They are now, you'll notice, the famed platoon of Navajo Indians. And this article is very different because this article is based on what they actually did. There's a couple of things I'd like to point out in this article. Number one, they received the highest score on the rifle range of any platoon to date going through this boot camp. It also mentions a couple of individual citations that were given to a few of the men, and it points out that all 29 of them graduated. And this was pretty amazing because even to this day, I've talked to recruiters that have told me that normally there's about a 10% dropout rate in boot camp. And so it was pretty intriguing that all 29 of them actually graduated. And then, of course, this is their platoon photograph. MCRD just recently went through all of their World War II platoon photographs and digitized them. So this is actually a really, really crisp copy of the World War II photograph. My father's in the top row, and he is the 5th man from your right. Okay, I want to very quickly go through the Navajo Code, as of course this is what this group was recruited for. So let's go back to the men. They finish boot camp. They are immediately assigned to communications. They really weren't given the standard furlough that they normally would have been given at this time. And I think it was because the Marine Corps really, really wanted to get this program underway. And if it was going to work, they wanted to get this started right away. So these men immediately were transferred over into communications. They learned all of the codes of the day. They learned how to, of course, work the equipment, clean the equipment, take it apart, put it together, all that kind of stuff. But they also were assigned to develop a code. And this was the first time that they were told that they were expected to create a code in their native language. So the Marine Corps handed them a list of about 200 words, which included a number of things. It included military equipment, military organization, such as, regiment, platoon, division, those kinds of words, ranks of officers, names of countries. It also had a very large general vocabulary, and they were also asked to develop a coded alphabet in Navajo. As I said, there were approximately 200 terms that they had to create in this first code. So the men set about doing their job. And in interviews that I did with some of these men back in the late 80s and early 90s, I asked them a lot of questions about how they did this code. They said they started with the alphabet because it seemed the most obvious and easiest to do. And they based it off the International Phonetic Alphabet code that was done at that time. And so what they did is they looked at the alphabet and they chose a word in English that started with the particular letter it would represent. However, in Navajo, that word was different. So the original code talkers came up with one word for each letter of the alphabet. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples here. So A, you can see the word in English starts with the letter A, ant, B, bear, C, cat, right? But in Navajo, it's different. So ant is wulichi, B, bear is shush, C, cat is musse. So the word in Navajo obviously doesn't start with the letter that it represented. So this was a little added layer of security in this code. But not long after the first 29 created this, and then the second, third group came in, the American cryptographers there on base were a little concerned about this for one particular reason, and that was that there was only one word for each letter of the alphabet. Now, if you're a cryptographer and you're trying to break a code, particularly an alphabetical code, you listen for certain things because languages have patterns, and in English there are certain patterns. So for example, we have words that have double consonants like better, butter, little, right? 2 T's. Words that end in certain ways, words that end in ER, words that end in LY. So cryptographers listen for those patterns, and so that's how they will break a code. They will listen for particularly repetitions of double consonants or of vowels. So because of this, they asked the later code talkers to add more terms to the alphabetical code. And so I'm just going to show you for A, B, and C. Some of them, they added 2 extra words. Others they added only 1 extra word. But for these 3 letters of the alphabet, as you can see, they added 2 words each. Okay, what else did they do? They came up with terms for equipment. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Airplanes, they named them after birds. They looked at the equipment and they looked at the animals that they were familiar with, and they kind of paired them together. So a patrol plane, if you've ever watched crows, you know, they're constantly flying out there looking for things, digging in the trash, doing things like that. So they looked for the characteristic of the bird, and they matched it up with the characteristic of the type of equipment they were naming. And then in some cases, they just made up new words, which was very common among Navajos. So for submarine, they called it an iron fish, or beshlo. They came up with ranks of officers, and in this case, pretty simple to understand what they did. They looked at, of course, their ranking on their shoulders and lapels, and that's how they came up with the various ranks. For military organization, they chose to use names of Navajo clans. And this is just a couple of examples. Division was Ashihi, or the Salt Clan, and regiment was Tabaha, or Edgewater Clan. They came up with names of countries. And in this case, they came up, developed just names or terms that could be used. So for the United States or America, they named it Nihima, or our mother. Okay, so my father, back to him, after the men created the code, after it was tested, the Marine Corps said, yes, this is great. They started to actively recruit more Navajos into the program. They were eventually to have about 400 Navajos that would serve as Navajo Code Talkers in the Pacific campaigns. The original group that my father was with, when they finished the code and were sent overseas, they were put into the 1st or 2nd Marine Division. My father was put into the 2nd Marine Division, and he fought in Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Tinian, and Saipan. These are a couple of pictures that actually my father are in. This was right after the Battle of Tarawa. He's standing just about in the middle with the helmet on, kind of a little crooked, and his shirt open in the back row. My father again on Saipan. Again on Saipan, my dad is to your right, Jack Nez in the middle with a cigarette in his mouth, and Oscar Ithma on the left. These are all 3 men who were with that original group. My father, after World War II, came back. He spent a year in a facility up in Klamath Falls, Oregon, that was a rehabilitation center. He was suffering from PTSD. So he spent a year there. And when he was discharged, he stayed in California and he decided to study art. So he went to Otis Art Institute. His prolific period of painting was during the 1950s and early 60s, but he remained an artist throughout his life. These are just a couple of images of some of his artwork. My father grew up, remember I mentioned he used to ride his favorite horse into the canyon. He loved horses. So that was a very prominent theme in many of his works. My father also designed the logo for the Navajo Code Talkers Association, and these are a couple of early renditions that he was playing with when he designed this in the early 1970s. The original patch of the Navajo Code Talkers looked like this. It did change somewhat over the period, so you'll find different renditions of this online. My father was an educator. He taught art history, Navajo language and culture, and he worked at 3 different universities: the University of California at Davis, Diné College on the Navajo Nation, and the University of New Mexico here at home. So that is in a nutshell my father's story. And this is a photograph that was taken by a Japanese photographer by the name of Kenji Kawano. Kenji married a Navajo. He became a well-known person on our reservation. He still is. He took many, many, many photographs of Navajos across the reservation, but a lot of them of the Navajo Code Talkers. So I just want to give him a shout out for this particular photograph. Okay, and with that, I will close and turn it over to Adam.
Zonnie, this was a fantastic story. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. We do have several questions, but the first one is, were Navajo Code Talkers only used in the Pacific?
Yes. The Navajo Code Talkers specifically were only used, they were only in the Marine Corps, and they were only used in the Pacific. Now, the U.S. Army did use Native Americans as early as World War I, and they continued it and expanded it to some extent in World War II. The Army's theater basically was more in Europe. They did have some Army in the Pacific, and they did use Indians in both places. There's a professor by the name of William Meadows from Missouri State University, who's written several articles, a couple of books about the Army Navajo, or the Army Code Talkers, not Navajos, but the Army Talkers. And he's identified about 20 plus Native American tribes that were used by the U.S. Army. With that said, it was a totally different kind of program. They were usually small groups of men from one particular tribe that were in a particular unit. And so, with only a small group, you can only, utilize it so much. The Marine Corps, on the other hand, devised a very intricate program where they had over 400 men that were not a unit, but rather they scattered them throughout all 6 Marine divisions at every level of communications. And it allowed them to communicate interdivisionally and to coordinate networks, particularly for landings and things like that. So it was used very, very differently. But yes, the Navajo Code Talkers were only in the Pacific.
Here's another question that we have. Were Carl's 2 brothers also, did they also join the Marine Corps?
No. I never knew Wallace, so I really don't know what happened to him, actually. He moved to California way before I was born, and I really don't know much of his life. And my uncle Steve, I think he was in the Army. I think he did go into the Army. He died back in the 70s, so I was a young kid at the time, so I really don't know that much about his life either. But I'm pretty sure he went into the Army.
There's another question. Can you describe the medal and its significance that's on your background?
The medal. Oh, yes. This medal behind me is one side of it, but this was the first medal that was given in recognition of Navajo Code Talkers in 1969 by the 4th Marine Division Association. In 1969, it was their 22nd annual reunion. It was in Chicago. They were actually recognizing Native Americans that served in the 4th Marine Division, and they struck these bronze medals. On the other side, it has the 4th Marine Division logo on it. And then on this side, you can see this is a painting by an artist by the name of Luis Grandee. And it's called Ira Hayes, His Dream, His Reality, I think. And of course, he was a Marine. So you can see him there on horse. He was a Pima Indian, and he was one of the ones that raised the flag on Iwo Jima. The Navajo Code Talkers that were in the 4th Marine Division received this medal, and then they chose a man from each of the other 5 divisions. My father was the one that represented the 2nd Marine Division, so that's why he got a medal.
It looks like we have just one more question. Let's see. Is there a timeline for the Code Talker Museum that broke ground earlier this year? So if you're familiar with that, maybe describe a little bit about what the Code Talker Museum will be, and then maybe answer.
Well, that's a good question. There's been a couple of different groundbreakings over the years. And so quite honestly, I'm not holding my breath. We'll see. It's also become, and is fast becoming even more so, highly politicized. So I'm not involved in it. I don't know what all the aspects of it are. I hope it happens. I hope we do have a museum eventually. Yeah, it's been talked about since the late 1990s, early 2000s. And as I said, there was an earlier groundbreaking in the early 2000s that unfortunately didn't happen. It became very politicized, and in some respects that's happening again today. So I would just wait and see, fingers crossed.
And the Code Talker Museum is supposed to be on the Navajo Nation lands?
Yes, it's right off the reservation. Well, it's on the reservation, but it's just outside the capital of the Navajo Nation, which is Window Rock. There's some mining that's been done on the reservation since the 1970s, and the Chevron Corporation has been doing a lot of strip mining in this area for quite a while. And so this is land that actually is in their jurisdiction, and it was land that was donated by them for a museum actually back in the early 2000s. So I guess they're looking at doing it on the same site. So hopefully we'll see.
Great. These are all some really great questions. And there were a few that I answered by text, but I will go ahead and say it out loud as well. Several people have asked how they can access the recording of this program, and it's going to be hosted on the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's YouTube in the Education on Demand playlist. The Chicago Public Library will also receive a copy of the program. So if you're part of the library audience, you will have access to the program. And with that, I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us. A special thank you to the Chicago Public Library for co-hosting the program with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. And of course, a huge thank you to Zonnie Gorman, who joined us, and a best of luck in your dissertation writing.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great day, and We look forward to seeing you next time.